Sarah Miller stood frozen as laughter erupted around her. The prestigious Apex Jiu-Jitsu Academy in Boston had fallen silent moments before, when instructor Blake Thompson deliberately swept her legs during the demonstration. "Ladies like you belong in spin class, not on these mats," he sneered, his black belt drawn tight around his waist. His students snickered, phones recording her humiliation. No one noticed her steady hands or the faded calluses as she quietly rose from the mat, her eyes briefly meeting his with unusual composure. A small military dog tag slipped from beneath her shirt as she straightened her gi. "Some people should know their limits," Blake announced to his class, but they had just mocked the wrong woman. "I wonder where you're watching this story unfold from today." Sarah's journey from this moment of public ridicule to what happens next reveals something. We all need to hear about courage, perseverance, and the quiet strength that often hides behind humble exteriors. Her story might just change how you see the challenges in your own life. The Dorchester neighborhood of Boston wasn't known for its luxury apartments or picturesque views. It was a working-class area where people minded their business and kept to themselves. That's exactly why Sarah Miller had chosen it. Her modest two-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a weathered brick building on Saville Avenue provided the anonymity she craved since leaving the Marines. The walls were thin, enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through them, but she didn't mind. The background noise helped drown out the occasional nightmares that still haunted her from her time overseas. Every morning, Sarah would wake before dawn, a habit ingrained from years of military discipline. She would brew a pot of strong black coffee in her small kitchen and sit by the window, watching the city slowly come to life as commuters headed to the subway station down the block. Her apartment was sparsely furnished. A second-hand couch, a wooden dining table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf filled with medical textbooks and military history. The only personal touches were a framed photo of her father in his Marine dress, blues and a shadow box containing his medals, and the dog tags she now wore around her neck. After finishing her coffee, Sarah would change into her work clothes and head to the Veterans Rehabilitation Center in Jamaica Plain where she worked as a physical therapist. Her colleagues respected her quiet efficiency and the special connection she formed with the veterans under her care. They didn't know about her own military background. Sarah never volunteered that information. To them, she was just a dedicated therapist who seemed to understand the unique challenges their patients faced. The center provided a sense of purpose that had been missing since her medical discharge from the Corps 4 years ago. Sarah had served 8 years as a combat instructor, teaching Marines hand-to-hand combat techniques before a roadside bomb in Afghanistan left her with shrapnel in her right shoulder and a medical discharge she hadn't wanted. The physical wounds had healed, leaving only a jagged scar that she often touched when stressed. But the psychological ones ran deeper. Her marriage hadn't survived the transition to civilian life. David, her ex-husband, had grown increasingly distant as her attempts to find her footing in the civilian world resulted in financial strain and frequent moves. "You need to let go of who you were and figure out who you are now," he'd said the night he left, his bags already packed by the door. Sarah hadn't argued. Maybe he was right. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, around the same time Sarah had first walked into Apex Jiu-Jitsu Academy. She had always found comfort in physical discipline, and after treating several veterans who spoke highly of how martial arts had helped their recovery, she decided to give it a try. The academy was located in an upscale part of the city, housed in a renovated warehouse with state-of-the-art facilities and a clientele that reflected its premium membership fee. It was a financial stretch for Sarah, but she justified the expense as an investment in her well-being. The head instructor, Blake Thompson, had made an impression from the start, and not a positive one. A former MMA fighter whose career had peaked. At regional championships, Blake carried himself with the inflated ego of someone who believed they deserved more recognition than they had received. He wore his black belt like a crown and expected newcomers to show appropriate deference. When Sarah had inquired about classes, his eyes had swept over her ordinary appearance with barely concealed dismissal. We do have some women who train here, he'd said, as if granting a rare privilege. But this isn't cardio kickboxing. It's intense training. Sarah had simply nodded, paid the registration fee, and signed up for beginners classes 3 times a week. For the first few months, Sarah had kept to herself, arriving early to classes and leaving promptly afterward. She absorbed techniques, like a sponge, applying the same methodical approach that had served her well in the military. While other newcomers struggled with basic movements, Sarah's body seemed to intuitively understand the principles of leverage and balance. She never revealed her background, preferring to be underestimated rather than singled out. But it was impossible to completely hide her natural aptitude, and eventually it caught the attention of both Blake and the other students. The incident that now had her standing humiliated in the middle of the training floor hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for weeks, ever since Blake had noticed her quietly correcting her partner's technique during a practice drill. "If you think you know better than me, Miller, maybe you should be teaching the class," he had commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. Sarah had apologized and stepped back, but the damage was done. She had committed the unforgivable sin of questioning the hierarchy of the academy, and Blake had been looking for an opportunity to put her in her place ever since. The opportunity had presented itself today during the advanced class that Sarah had recently been permitted to join. Blake had called her to the center of the mat for a demonstration, ostensibly to show a defensive technique against a larger opponent. What followed wasn't instruction, but humiliation. He had swept her legs with unnecessary force, sending her crashing to the mat with a thud that knocked the wind from her lungs. Now, as the laughter subsided, Sarah tucked the dog tags back under her gi and got to her feet. Her face betrayed nothing of the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Thank you for the demonstration, sir," she said quietly, bowing slightly, as protocol demanded. Blake's smirk widened as he turned to address the class. "This is why proper training matters. Some people just don't have what it takes, no matter how hard they try." The message was clear. Sarah didn't belong here. As she stepped back to rejoin the other students, a young woman named Claire leaned over with a whisper just loud enough to be heard. That's what happens when soccer moms try to play tough. More snickers followed. Sarah endured the remainder of the class in silence, executing each technique with mechanical precision, while ignoring the sideways glances and whispered comments. When Blake assigned partners for sparring, she found herself deliberately isolated. "Miller, you can sit this one out and observe. You might learn something," Blake instructed, not bothering to hide his disdain. So she sat against the wall, watching as others trained, noting their movements, their strengths, their weaknesses. It wasn't the first time she'd been sidelined, and she doubted it would be the last. After class, as others filed out to the locker rooms, Blake approached her. "The mats need cleaning. Since you're not using them properly anyway, you might as well make yourself useful." He tossed a spray bottle and towel at her feet before walking away. Sarah waited until everyone had left before quietly completing the task. It wasn't the work that bothered her. She'd done far worse in the military, but the deliberate attempt to demean her. As she wiped down the last section of mat, she noticed Maxwell Reed, the owner of the academy, watching from the doorway of his office. Maxwell Reed was a businessman first and a martial artist second. In his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual expression of calculation, he had built Apex into one of the most profitable me's in Boston. The walls of his office were covered with photos of him, alongside famous fighters and celebrities who had trained at his facilities. "Sarah, isn't it? Can I have a word?" he called out, gesturing for her to join him. Sarah set aside the cleaning supplies and followed him into the office, standing at attention out of habit while he settled into the leather chair behind his desk. "I've been observing your progress," he began, steepling his fingers. "Blake has expressed some concerns about your fit with our program." Sarah remained expressionless, waiting for him to continue. "Apex has a reputation to maintain. Our clients expect a certain level of excellence, We don't offer participation trophies here. He paused, clearly expecting some response, but Sarah simply held his gaze. Maxwell sighed. Look, we have women-only beginner classes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I think you might be more comfortable there. It wasn't a suggestion, but a thinly veiled directive. With all due respect, sir, I've paid for the advanced class, Sarah replied evenly. Maxwell's expression hardened slightly. Well, there's also the matter of your membership fee. We've had to implement some additional training requirements for advanced students. There'll be a supplementary charge of $60 per month. It was a transparent attempt to price her out, but Sarah didn't flinch. I understand. Will that be included in next month's payment? Maxwell seemed slightly taken back by her composure. Yes, and I'll need you to sign this waiver for our promotional materials. He slid a form across the desk. Sarah glanced down at it, noting the clause that granted Apex rights to use any videos or photos of her for marketing purposes, including, she suspected, the humiliating footage from today's class. She signed it without comment. Her signature, as controlled as her expression. The following week brought new levels of ostracism. Sarah arrived at the academy to find printouts of screen captures from the video of her takedown pinned to the bulletin board captioned with "Technique Gone Wrong." Students she had previously trained with now avoided partnering with her during exercises. We need someone who can actually contribute, one of the men said loudly when she approached his group during water breaks. Conversations would halt when she neared, only to resume in hushed tones once she passed. Her gym bag had been moved from its usual spot in the locker room and placed near the bathroom. A not-so-subtle message about her status in the hierarchy. Blake had escalated his campaign of degradation, using her as the example of incorrect technique in every demonstration. This is how beginners make mistakes, he would announce, forcing Sarah to hold positions that strained her injured shoulder while he slowly explained everything she was doing wrong. When new potential members toured the facility, he would make a point of criticizing her in front of them. Some people just can't grasp the fundamentals no matter how much time they spend here, he told one prospect. Loud enough for the entire class to hear, but we welcome all levels, even if they never advance. Sarah's treatment at Apex soon spread beyond its walls. During an open mat session at a neighboring academy, where practitioners from different schools could train together, she overheard whispers as she entered. That's the woman from Apex, the one who doesn't know her place. No one offered to partner with her, and when she finally approached someone, they made an excuse about needing to leave early. At a local coffee shop near the academy, she recognized two students from her class at the counter ahead of her. Did you see that pathetic attempt at an armbar yesterday? One said to the other, not realizing she was behind them. Blake says, she's the perfect example of why some people should stick to yoga. They noticed her then and had the decency to look embarrassed, but neither apologized. The barista, who had witnessed the exchange, gave her an extra shot in her latte without charging her. Don't let the meatheads get you down, she said quietly as she handed over the cup. It was a small kindness in what had become an increasingly hostile environment. The humiliation even spilled into Sarah's personal life. Her ex-husband, David, texted her after somehow seeing one of the videos that had made its way online. This is why I couldn't stay. You never know when to quit, his message read. Always trying to prove something instead of knowing your limitations. Sarah had stared at the text for a long time before deleting it without response. At work, she noticed some of her colleagues giving her strange looks. One of her regular patients, a retired businessman recovering from knee surgery, requested a different therapist without explanation. Later, she overheard the receptionist mentioning that he'd seen that video and didn't feel comfortable with someone who showed such poor judgment. Even her landlord, who had spotted her practicing movements in the courtyard of their building one evening, made his disapproval clear. Don't bring that violent stuff around here, he warned. We've got families with kids in this building. The financial strain of the increased membership fees at Apex was beginning to take its toll as well. Sarah had started taking extra weekend, Shifts at the rehabilitation center and cut back on everything but the essentials to make the payments, determined not to be forced out by economic pressure. Despite everything, Sarah continued to attend classes at Apex with the same quiet determination that had characterized her military career. Each humiliation, each slight, each deliberate exclusion was absorbed and filed away, fuel for the discipline that kept her returning. In the evenings, she would practice in her apartment, moving furniture aside to create enough space for solo drills. What no one at Apex knew was that twice a week, Sarah also trained at a community center in Dorchester with Master Sergeant James Wilson, a former Marine combat instructor who had recognized her at the VA hospital where he received treatment for his own injuries. Wilson had approached her after a therapy session, the familiar set of her shoulders and watchful eyes, marking her as a fellow Marine, even in civilian clothes. "You're wasted here, Miller," he'd said bluntly. "You should be teaching, not just treating." When Sarah explained her interest in jiu-jitsu, Wilson had nodded approvingly. "Good choice. I've got a small group that meets at the community center. Nothing fancy, but it's real training with real respect. You should join us." Under Wilson's guidance, Sarah had progressed far beyond the level she showed at Apex, mastering techniques that Blake was still struggling to execute properly. Wilson understood the strategy behind her deliberate underperformance. "Sometimes the best advantage is being underestimated," he'd said during one of their sessions. "But remember, there comes a point when you have to show your true capabilities. The question is when and where you choose to do that." The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. The Boston Open Jiu-Jitsu tournament was a prestigious regional competition that attracted participants from across New England. Apex always fielded a strong team with Blake himself competing in the black belt division where he typically placed in the top 5. Sarah had registered for the women's blue belt division despite still being officially ranked as a white belt at Apex. Blake had refused to promote her despite her clear technical proficiency, another way of keeping her in her place. When she submitted her registration through the academy as required, Blake had confronted her in front of the entire class. "Miller, I saw your tournament registration. Are you trying to embarrass yourself in this academy? You're not ready for competition." Sarah had maintained her composure. "I'd like the opportunity to test my skills, sir." Blake's face had wrined. "Your skills? That's rich. Save yourself the embarrassment. I'm pulling your registration, but it was too late." The registration had already been processed, and Sarah had paid the non-refundable fee. Tournament rules required academy approval for registration, but not for participation once registered. It was a technicality that infuriated Blake, but one he couldn't circumvent. The morning of the tournament arrived with a spring chill in the air. Sarah woke before dawn as usual, but instead of her typical routine, she sat on the edge of her bed and held her father's dog tags in her palm. Staff Sergeant Robert Miller had been a Marine like his daughter after him, serving 20 years before retiring to teach high school history in their small Pennsylvania hometown. He had passed away from cancer 2 years before Sarah's injury in Afghanistan, never seeing her difficult transition to civilian life. "Focus on the mission, not the noise," he used to tell her whenever she faced adversity. Today, that was exactly what she intended to do. She tucked the dog tags beneath her tournament gi and headed to the convention center, where the competition was being held. The Apex team had arranged to meet in the lobby, but when Sarah arrived, she was greeted with cold stars and deliberate exclusion from the pre-competition huddle. Blake was at the center, giving last-minute advice to his favored students while ignoring her presence completely. Claire, the young woman who had mocked Sarah after her humiliation in class, smugly informed her that she should wait elsewhere. "This is for serious competitors only," she said with a smirk. "Blake doesn't want you distracting the team." Sarah nodded and moved away, finding a quiet corner to begin her warm-up routine. She ran through mobility exercises and breathing techniques, centering herself as she had been taught in the Marines. As she stretched, she observed the Apex team, noting how Blake focused all his attention on the male competitors, while giving only cursory advice to the 2 other women who would be competing. The tournament area was already filling with spectators and participants from dozens of themis across the region. On the far side of the hall, Sarah spotted Master Sergeant Wilson arriving with his small group from the community center. He caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, a gesture that meant more to her than any pep talk from Blake could have. The women's blue belt division was scheduled for the early afternoon, giving Sarah plenty of time to observe other matches and mentally prepare. She watched as the first Apex competitors took to the mats with Blake shouting instructions from the sidelines. Most performed well, advancing to the next rounds as expected from a prestigious academy. When Claire competed in the women's purple belt division, Blake was especially vocal, his attention fully engaged in a way it never was for Sarah. Claire won her first match handily, but lost in the semifinals, returning to the team area in tears. Blake consoled her with an arm around her shoulders. "You were robbed," he insisted loud enough for the nearby referees to hear. "That take-on was perfect." As the morning progressed, an announcement came over the loudspeaker that caused a stir throughout the venue. "Attention competitors in the men's black belt division. Due to a medical withdrawal, we have a slot available, according to tournament. Rules: the slot will be filled by the next eligible alternate. Would Sarah Miller please report to the registration desk?" The Apex team fell silent, all eyes turning to Sarah in confusion. Blake immediately stormed toward the officials' table, his face contorted with anger. Sarah calmly gathered her bag and followed, maintaining a respectful distance as Blake confronted the tournament director. "There must be some mistake," he insisted. "Sarah Miller's a white belt from my academy. She can't possibly compete in the black belt division." The tournament director, a stern woman in her 60s with decades of martial arts experience, consulted her computer. According to our records, Ms. Miller qualified as an alternate based on her submission for consideration in the expert division. Her credentials were validated by Master Sergeant James Wilson, a certified instructor with the appropriate ranking to sponsor a competitor. Blake turned to Sarah, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What credentials? What is this? Fraud?" Before Sarah could respond, Master Sergeant Wilson appeared beside her. "No fraud, Thompson." Staff Sergeant Miller was one of the Marine Corps' top hand-to-hand combat instructors before her medical discharge, and she's more than qualified for this division. The revelation hit the gathering crowd like a thunderclap. Sarah's fellow students from Apex stared in shock as the pieces fell into place. The unusual composure under pressure, the quick mastery of techniques, the calloused hands and watchful eyes that spoke of experience beyond a civilian gym. Blake struggled to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous. She's never demonstrated black belt-level skills in my academy." The tournament director's patience was wearing thin. "Mr. Thompson, the verification has been completed according to tournament rules. Either Ms. Miller fills the slot or we move to the next alternate. Those are the options." Blake looked around desperately, noticing the attention their confrontation was attracting. Other competitors and spectators had gathered, drawn by the unusual situation. With no graceful way to object further without seeming petty, Blake reluctantly backed down. "Fine. Let her embarrass herself then." As he turned to walk away, the tournament director called after him. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, according to the bracket adjustment, you'll be Ms. Miller's first opponent." Blake froze mid-step, then slowly turned back, his expression now a mixture of shock and barely concealed panic. That can't be right. But it was, and everyone present knew it. The confrontation had drawn enough attention that changing the bracket now would raise questions about favoritism or manipulation. Blake was trapped by his own outburst. News of the unusual pairing spread quickly through the tournament venue. By the time Sarah and Blake were called to their mat, a substantial crowd had gathered to witness what many expected to be either a quick humiliation or an interesting upset. Sarah removed her warm-up jacket, revealing arms corded with lean muscle, usually hidden beneath her baggy works clothes. A small gasp went up from some of the Apex students who had never seen this side of their supposedly untalented classmate. Blake tried to maintain his confident demeanor as they bowed to each other and the referee, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed his anxiety. The whistle blew, signaling the start of the match. Blake immediately moved forward aggressively, attempting to establish dominance with a strong collar grip. Sarah remained defensive for the first few seconds, gauging his approach and timing. Then, with a fluidity that seemed almost casual, she executed a perfect sleeve drag, creating just enough space to slide into position for an arm guard. The movement was so smooth, so technically precise that Blake had no time to defend properly. Within 14 seconds of the starting whistle, Sarah had isolated his arm and applied the submission hold with textbook perfection. The crowd fell silent as Blake frantically tapped the mat, signaling his submission. The referee raised Sarah's hand in victory as Blake scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. 14 seconds, someone in the crowd announced loudly, checking the official timer. She submitted him in 14 seconds. The murmurs grew as Blake stormed off the mat without the customary handshake, shoving past his stunned teammates. Sarah stood calmly at the center of the mat, bowing respectfully to the referee and the judges before turning to leave. Master Sergeant Wilson approached, offering a rare smile and a firm handshake. "Clean execution, Miller. Your father would be proud." At the mention of her father, Sarah's composure wavered slightly. She touched the dog tags beneath her gi. "Thank you, sir." As she walked back to her gear bag, she passed the Apex team. Most averted their eyes, but Claire stared openly, her previous smugness replaced by confusion and a dawning respect. The tournament continued with Sarah advancing through subsequent rounds with the same quiet efficiency. She didn't win the division. Her semi-final opponent was a legitimate world-class competitor with years more experience, but her performance was remarkable enough that officials began reviewing footage of her earlier matches, including the 14-second submission of Blake. They saw raised serious questions about the culture and practices at Apex Jiu-Jitsu Academy. By the end of the tournament, videos of Sarah's matches had spread throughout the martial arts community. The contrast between her treatment at Apex and her obvious skill level prompted outrage from many respected instructors. Tournament officials had received condition that Claire understand the special needs and boundaries of trauma survivors. It was the beginning of a productive mentoring relationship that eventually led Claire to pursue studies in physical therapy herself. Even Maxwell Reed attempted to repair the relationship, offering Sarah a position as head instructor at a new Apex location with complete autonomy over the curriculum and culture. She declined politely, but used the opportunity to advocate for structural changes in how the academy evaluated and treated students of all backgrounds and abilities. 6 months after the tournament, Sarah's program had expanded to 3 locations across Boston, with support from both the VA and private grants for community health initiatives. She maintained her full-time position at the Rehabilitation Center, but had reduced her hours slightly to accommodate the growing demand for her specialized training. Master Sergeant Wilson served as her assistant instructor, his gruff demeanor and technical expertise complementing her more measured approach. Together, they created a curriculum that addressed both the physical and psychological aspects of recovery through martial arts. Sarah kept her father's dog tags with her at all times, now openly worn over her gi during training sessions. They had become something of a trademark, a visual reminder of the heritage of discipline and service that informed her teaching. The signature armbar technique that had defeated Blake was now jokingly referred to as the 14-second solution by her students. Though Sarah discouraged focusing on that aspect of her story, "The technique isn't special," she would explain during instruction. "It's the preparation, focus, and timing that make it effective. Those are skills anyone can develop with proper training." On the anniversary of her father's death, Sarah visited his grave in Pennsylvania, placing a small stone on his headstone, as was her tradition. Beside it, she left a recent photograph of her with her students, many of them veterans like herself, who had found a path forward through the discipline and community of martial arts. "You were right, Dad," she said quietly to the granite marker. "The mission is what matters, not the noise." As she turned to leave, she noticed an elderly man watching from a respectful distance. He approached slowly, using a cane for support. "You're Robert Miller's daughter, aren't you?" he asked. "The one who's been teaching veterans in Boston." Sarah nodded, curious about the stranger's connection to her father. "I'm Richard Townsend. Your father and I served together in Lebanon back before you were born. He saved my life during the barracks bombing." The man's eyes grew distant with memory. He never talked about it, never wanted recognition, just did what needed doing, and moved on to the next mission. He focused on Sarah again, a smile creasing his weathered face. "You remind me of him. Same quiet strength. He'd be mighty proud of." "What you're building." The unexpected encounter felt like a completion of a circle, a confirmation that the path she had chosen honored not just her father's memory, but the values he had lived by. Back in Boston, Sarah continued to build her program, focusing on those who needed it most rather than those who could pay the most. Her approach attracted attention from military and civilian organizations alike, resulting in invitations to develop similar programs across the country. The 14 seconds that had changed the trajectory of her life were now just a footnote in a larger story of service and transformation. When new students asked about the infamous tournament match, she would acknowledge it briefly before redirecting their attention to the fundamentals they needed to master: respect, discipline, and perseverance. She would tell them, "Those are the foundations. The techniques are just tools." The dog tags that had slipped from beneath her gi during that first humiliating encounter at Apex now represented not just her father's legacy, but her own emerging one. A reminder that true strength often lies hidden beneath unassuming exteriors, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Some people mistake kindness for weakness and silence for acceptance. But as Sarah showed us, true strength isn't about dominating others. It's about knowing your worth when no one else does. What challenge are you facing today that requires this kind of quiet courage? If Sarah's story inspired you, support our channel by subscribing and giving this video a like.